Hello YouTube. In previous videos, I discussed envelopes, which is the shape of your sound over time. And I also discussed harmonics, which is the frequency content of a sound, which is like the vertical dimension of a track. And today I want to talk about the third dimension, which is the stereo width of your track. This can be achieved in a variety of ways, which I'll cover in this video, and it can have a huge impact on the perceived loudness. Perceived loudness is a topic for another video. For now, I'm just going to talk about different methods of inducing stereo width into your track. And with no more ado whatsoever, let's get into it. Okay, so here we have an instance of serum. The first way that you can create some stereo is panning. If I just attach an LFO onto the pan here, you should be able to hear this sound moving from one ear over to the next ear. Make sure to have an appropriate monitoring device, headphones for example, otherwise you won't hear this effect. And that is the most straightforward way to push things out into the side of your mix. If I just make this a quicker rate maybe and reduce the amount, the sound has become a little bit wider there. The next way of introducing a bit of information on the sides is through unison voices. For this example, I'm just going to get a saw wave. I'm going to increase these unison voices to something like 7. You can hear that it's a much wider sound than if it was just a mono central focused sound. The amount of detuning determines how fast these waveforms drift apart from each other, thus determining the movement that you get from it. And then you start to get really dissonant towards the later stages of this, and it just completely falls apart. This random phase knob will change the way that these unison voices behave. So if I turn this all the way down, what you're going to hear is that all of the waveforms start at the same position, but then drift apart from each other as it's played through. The amount that these extra voices are moved into the stereo field is based off of this setting in the global. So if I bring the width all the way down to 0, you'll be able to hear that it's flattening all of these different voices into a central channel. The effect of the detuning becomes much more pronounced then. Bring up the random phase again. What's actually happening with this is a concept called phase cancellation, which I'll explain using a sine wave. Grab myself the sine wave. If I grab another sine wave, you'll be able to hear that both the sine waves are summing together to become a louder version of itself. But as soon as I start to play with this phase knob, it's going to get quieter and quieter until these shapes are fully flipped, and then they will completely cancel each other out. With that out of the way, I'm going to grab myself a saw wave once again, give it some unison voices with a bit of random. I'm going to put on a filter so it's a bit less harsh. And let's just give it a nice soft envelope. Let's get a few more voices than that. So what creates stereo width is a difference in the left and right channels. So what we can do is we can add in a chorus. What a chorus is doing is it's just delaying copies of the sound, and so we get a nice wide effect. If I dial in these amounts here, And if I bring the depth and the rate all the way down, then we're just having this static delay time. And if I change this delay time, we're getting a slightly different tone. And then you can just blend that into taste. The next thing that you can do is add a phaser. Which is adding filtering through the spectrum. But because of this depth knob, we're getting slight differences in the left and the right channels. So if we make this a nice slow rate and set the frequency to something that we like. And then just bring that mix back down. So we're letting most of the original sound through, but just adding in a little bit of this flavor. A little bit goes a long way. So the next way we can introduce some stereo width is using a delay. And a delay is just an echo which takes whatever is fed into it and repeats it over. And the amount of repeats it has is based on this feedback knob here. And within the delay, we have an option called ping pong, which means that each echo that it does bounces from the left to the right ear. And then we have a filter band here that allows us to constrain the spectrum of these repeats. To make this effect a bit more obvious, I'm just going to go and attach a nice jump in this cutoff so it gets a lot brighter for a select moment, which will then help the delay pick out a moment to carry over. That's getting a bit more interest going now in the sides. And you can change the delay time for each ear, which will make it even more imbalanced and thus create an even wider effect. Another thing that we can do is just add on a bit of reverb, which emulates the sound being in a space. And this will create some nice little bits of stereo information for your sound. If I just dial in these settings a bit, I usually like to have my low cut quite high because I don't need any of that rumbly reverb frequency that builds up very quickly. So for cleaner sounds, you want to make sure to cut out a lot of that low out of your reverb. And if I turn up the mix now, and a flanger is another effect that uses a delayed version of the signal, and the depth is how delayed that signal is. So if I just blend it in parallel also, if I set this rate down to 0 as well, then it's going to be a fixed delay. I'll turn this down a bit more now. So now we have a pretty decently wide sound. Serum also has this effect called hyper, which can do the same effect as unison voices, giving copies of the sound you can then detune by a certain amount. It also has this dimension, which is copying the sound for the left and right and offsetting them as well as flipping the phase of one of them. So it gets this really wide effect, but also you have to be careful because it can cause problems. And that's the majority of the concepts when it comes to adding a bit of width into your sound. Essentially, what it is differences in the right and left channels. What I'm going to do to finish off is create a very classic sound that is used absolutely everywhere, and that is the respace, because it's such a versatile sound. So I'm going to just make a nice simple respace that uses these stereo imaging ideas that we've talked about. A respace basically comes from using unison detuning to create movement. So I've got some MIDI set up here. If I turn the octave down, and if I turn on the mono and legato, always, and portamento, bring that up. This way, only one note at a time can be triggered, and when two notes overlap, they will glide between each other. To start off with, what I'm going to do is get a couple of voices of unison. Set a nice detuning amount. I'm going to go into the global settings and I'm going to bring the width down to 0, which will flatten this down into a mono sound and have that detuning be a lot more pronounced. When you jump to higher notes, you can hear how the detuning movement is increased. If I play a nice low note, you can hear that pulsating. And if I play a much higher note, you get a much quicker cycling through of that detuning movement. What we can do to make this even more exciting, tie the note tracking feature onto the detuning to exaggerate this effect. That sounds pretty good to me. And then what we can do is get some filtering going, set a nice rate for this as well on an LFO. And maybe set this rate on the key tracking as well. Let's make this a steeper filter as well. Sounds pretty good. And then I'm going to add in a second saw wave, which is going to be an octave higher. I can add a different amount of unison voices, perhaps. Put that through the filter as well. Lower the volume of this one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign the key tracking onto the detuning of this one as well. Fantastic. Moving on, let's just add some distortion because everything sounds better with distortion. And then to emphasize that wobbling movement, I'm going to attach this LFO onto the distortion just a bit. Because of the detuning of the saw waves here, we're having a fluctuation in our lowest frequency. Not ideal if we want a nice solid low end. So what we'll do is we'll remove the lowest harmonic and add in our very own sub. So now we have a nice solid low end going. I'll add a bit more movement into this and a bit more width by getting this phaser involved. Make this rate nice and slow. And we'll get a chorus and just get a nice bit of movement going. If you click on this option, it goes from a low pass filter to a high pass filter. So if you want to be more selective of which frequencies are having this chorus effect, then you can just use this little knob here to isolate where you want that stereo to be happening. So at the moment, I'm just going to go with a high pass filter. So it's only happening on the higher frequencies. Something that I want to point out, which is really important to keep in mind, the order of your effects matters a lot. So with widening effects, if you put them after your distortion, you're going to get a cleaner sound because the sound is being distorted and then you're making the copies. Whereas if you have the widening before the distortion, then you get a grittier sound. So before it, you get this gritty texture. I'm going to add on a bit of hyper as well, bring the mix way down, play with my detune amounts. And then show you the difference of before and after the distortion. You get a lot more grit when it comes right before the distortion. I like the sound of that. What I'm going to do to add just a bit more interest in the sound is add a little bit of filtering, because whatever you feed into the distortion is going to affect the frequencies that it distorts. If I give it a little boost here, make a nice little 1 bar movement thing here. And then if I get a cut doing the opposite motion to that with a notch filter, you get really, really nice characteristics. To finish this patch off, what I'll do is I'll add on another filter at the very end, and this will just smooth everything out once again and cut away all the harmonics that we've added using this distortion. So that sounds pretty damn good to me. What we can do to get variations in this sound is altering maybe the detune amounts. Or we can play with the semitones. So let's go 7 semitones up, which is a perfect fifth. The last thing I'm going to do is just add in a little bit of white noise in the background. And this white noise is just going to fill out the sound a little bit more. And that can go in the filter as well by checking this little noise button here. And I may as well attach that to the movement as well. That way we have a nice uniform pulse in this sound. And there we have it. It's a pretty nice sounding respace that you can use in your tracks. That brings me to the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed that. If you want more content, you guys know what to do. And with that being said, I will see you in the next video.